Cactus Jack's laughter echoed through the saloon as he slammed his fist on the poker table, scattering cards across the whiskey-stained wood. "I'll raise you, Maverick. Could vote. Not with money." His tobacco-stained grin widened as he pointed toward the corner where a woman sat motionless in a wooden chair with wheels. "I'll bet you Violet Rainsong there. Pretty thing, ain't she? Too bad she can't walk." The other men at the table shifted uncomfortably, but Maverick's steel-gray eyes never wavered from his cards. He'd been nursing the same bottle of rotgut for 3 hours, watching these vultures circle the woman like she was carrion. Violet's dark hair cascaded over shoulders that held themselves with dignity despite her circumstances, and her emerald eyes burned with a fire that hadn't been extinguished by whatever cruel fate had stolen the use of her legs. "You're talking about a human being, Jack," Maverick said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd seen too much cruelty in his 32 years. "A broken one," Jack cackled, and several men joined in. "Found her outside Temperance Creek, after that wagon train got hit by bandits. Legs don't work no more, been feeding her out of charity, but hell, she's just talking up space. You win this hand, she's your problem." Maverick's jaw tightened as he glanced at Violet. She was listening to every word, her hands clenched in her lap, but her chin remained raised. Something in her posture reminded him of a wild Mustang he'd once seen broken by circumstance, but unbroken in spirit. "And if I lose?" Maverick asked, though his mind was already made up. "Your ranch?" The whole Broken Arrow spread. The saloon fell silent, except for the tick of the old grandfather clock. Maverick had built that ranch from nothing after the war, carved it out of hostile territory with his bare hands and the sweat of his brow. It was all he had left of his dreams, his future, his identity. He looked at his cards, a pair of jacks and nothing else. Jack was holding at least 3 of a kind, judging by his confident smirk. This was a losing hand, and they both knew it. Maverick met Violet's eyes across the smoky room. In them he saw not pity or desperation, but a quiet plea not to be saved, but to be treated with dignity. In that moment, he realized that some things mattered more than land, more than security, more than the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart. "Deal the cards," he said, laying his hand face down on the table. 20 minutes later, Maverick walked across the saloon floor toward Violet, his spurs jangling with each step. He'd lost everything: his ranch, his cattle, his livelihood. But as he approached the woman who was now, by the cruel terms of a card game, his responsibility, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. "Miss Rainsong," he said, removing his hat and crouching beside her chair. "My name is Maverick Cade. I reckon we both got dealt a bad hand tonight, but maybe we can make something better out of it." For the first time that evening, Violet smiled. The wagon wheels creaked in rhythm with Maverick's heartbeat as they left the dusty town of Redemption behind. He'd traded his last good horse for the wagon and supplies, keeping only Thunderbolt, his faithful stallion, to pull them toward an uncertain future. Violet sat beside him on the wooden bench, wrapped in his bedroll coat, her green eyes scanning the endless prairie that stretched before them like a promise. "You didn't have to do this," she said, for the 3rd time since they'd left town. Her voice carried the soft accent of the Eastern Territories, cultured and refined, a stark contrast to his rough frontier drawl. "Did what?" Maverick kept his eyes on the trail, but he could feel her gaze on his weathered profile. "Lose everything for a stranger." He finally turned to look at her, noting how the afternoon sun caught the copper highlights in her dark hair. "Who says I lost anything?" Violet's laugh was bitter. "I heard the terms of that game. It had the Broken Arrow Ranch, 3,000 acres, prime grazing land, a house your grandfather built with his own hands. Jack told everyone in the saloon before you arrived. Cactus Jack talks too much." Maverick guided the wagon around a cluster of prairie dog holes. "Besides, what good is land if you're too proud or too scared to do what's right? What's right is being saddled with a crippled woman you don't know." The harshness in her own voice made Violet wince, but Maverick just shrugged. "Maybe what's right is giving both of us a chance at something better than what we had." They traveled in comfortable silence for several miles before Violet spoke again. "Where exactly are we going? You don't have the ranch anymore. Old Jeremiah Crow owes me a favor from the war." He's got a small spread up near Whispering Creek. Nothing fancy, but it's got a cabin and enough land for a garden. He said I could work it in exchange for keeping the wolves away from his cattle. Charity, Violet said quietly. Partnership, Maverick corrected. Same as what we got between us now. As evening approached, Maverick pulled the wagon into a sheltered grove near a stream. Without a word, he began unhitching thunderbolts and setting up camp. Violet watched him work, noting the efficient way he moved, the gentle manner he used with his horse, the way he kept glancing back to make sure she was comfortable. I can cook, she said suddenly. Yeah, my legs don't work, but my hands are fine. Maverick paused in his work of gathering firewood. That'd be appreciated. They worked together in easy synchronization, Maverick handling the tasks that required mobility. Violet preparing their simple meal of beans and hardtack from her seat beside the fire. As darkness settled over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, they shared their first meal together. Maverick said gently. Violet's spoon stilled in her bowl. Bandits hit her wagon train 6 months ago. I was traveling to San Francisco to marry a man I'd never met. A business arrangement my father made before he died. The bandits killed most of the men, took what they wanted from the wagons. I got caught in the crossfire, took a bullet in my spine. She touched her lower back unconsciously. Doctor in Temperance Creek said I'd never walk again. I'm sorry. Don't be. That bullet might have crippled my legs, but it freed me from a life I never wanted. She looked up at him through the flickering firelight. What about you? What made a man willing to gamble away his whole life for a stranger? Maverick poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing into the night sky. Maybe I figured my old life wasn't worth keeping if it didn't have room for doing what's right. Later, as Violet lay wrapped in blankets beneath the wagon and Maverick kept watch by the dying fire, she whispered into the darkness, "Thank you." For what? For seeing me as a person, not a burden. Get some rest, Violet. Tomorrow we start building something new. The cabin at Whispering Creek was smaller than a decent-sized chicken coop, with walls that let in almost as much wind as they kept out. Jeremiah Crow, a grizzled old-timer with kind eyes and hands gnarled by arthritis, helped Maverick carry Violet inside while apologizing for the rough conditions. Ain't much to look at, Jeremiah said, gesturing at the single room with its stone fireplace and dirt floor, but the roof sound and the creek runs year-round. It's perfect, Violet said firmly, though Maverick caught her slight shiver as a cold breeze whistled through a gap in the chinked logs. That first week, Maverick threw himself into repairs with the intensity of a man possessed. He patched the walls, built proper shutters for the windows, and constructed a wooden floor that would keep the dampness at bay. But his most important project was a set of ramps and railings that would allow Violet to move freely between the cabin and the outdoors in her wheeled chair. You don't have to rebuild the whole territory for me, Violet protested on the third day, watching him struggle to install a complex pulley system near the front door. I'm not rebuilding it for you, Maverick grunted, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. I'm rebuilding it with you. The distinction mattered more than Violet could express. For months, she'd been the object of pity, charity, or crude jokes. But Maverick treated her as an equal partner in their unlikely enterprise. When he consulted her about where to place the vegetable garden, he genuinely listened to her answers. When she suggested improvements to the cabin's layout, he implemented them without question. In the evenings after Maverick returned from his daily rides checking Jeremiah's cattle, they would sit by the fireplace and talk. Violet told him about her life before the accident, how she'd been raised in Boston society. Educated in literature and music, trained to be the perfect ornamental wife. Maverick shared stories of his childhood on the frontier, his service in the war, and the dreams that had driven him to build the Broken Arrow Ranch. Do you regret it? Violet asked one night, as they sat watching the flames dance in the hearth. Losing everything you worked for? Maverick considered the question seriously. Outside wind howled across the prairie, but inside their small cabin, warmth and light created a pocket of peace in the vast wilderness. I thought that ranch was my whole world, he said finally. Turns out I was wrong. What's your world now? He turned to look at her, noting how the firelight turned her dark hair to burnished copper and brought out the gold flecks in her green eyes. Still figuring that out? 3 weeks into their partnership, Violet made a discovery that changed everything. While organizing supplies in the cabin's small storage area, she found an old violin case wedged behind a broken chair. When she opened it, her breath caught. The instrument inside was scarred and missing a string, but it was still beautiful. Jeremiah's late wife was musical, Maverick explained when she showed him the find. She used to play for the whole valley. When folks gathered for barn raisings and such, that night, after Maverick had replaced the broken string with wire from a fence repair kit, Violet drew the bow across the strings for the first time in months. The music that filled their small cabin was hauntingly beautiful, a melody that spoke of loss and hope, of endings and new beginnings. When she finished playing, Maverick was standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands and something indefinable in his eyes. "That was beautiful," he said quietly. "Music was the one thing my father never tried to control," Violet said, running her fingers lovingly over the violin's worn wood. "He said a lady could play for her own amusement. Maybe it's time you played for more than just amusement." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, blanketing their small world in pristine white. But inside the cabin, surrounded by music and warmth, and the growing connection between two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, spring seemed just around the corner. Winter settled over Whispering Creek like a heavy quilt, transforming the landscape into a crystalline wonderland that took Violet's breath away. From her chair beside the cabin's single window, she watched Maverick work in the cold, his breath forming clouds as he chopped firewood and tended to the animals Jeremiah had entrusted to their care. The violin had become her constant companion. Each evening, as Maverick returned from his daily rounds, she would play sometimes classical pieces from her Boston education, sometimes simple folk tunes she remembered from childhood, and increasingly melodies that seemed to flow from her heart without conscious thought. "You're composing," Maverick observed one evening as she finished a particularly haunting piece. He sat on the floor beside her chair, close enough that she could smell the pine scent that clung to his clothes and the lingering warmth of his presence. "I suppose I am." Violet set the violin carefully in its case. I never had the freedom to create before. My music teachers always insisted on perfect replication of the masters. This is better than the masters." She laughed softly. "You say that, but you've probably heard fewer than a dozen songs in your entire life. I've heard enough to know something special when I hear it." His voice carried a conviction that made her pulse quicken. "There's a story in your music, Violet. Pain, yes, but something else too. Something ... hopeful." Their eyes met in the firelight, and for a moment, the space between them seemed to hum with possibilities neither dared voice. Then Thunderbolt whinnied outside, breaking the spell, and Maverick rose to check on the animals before bed. But something had shifted between them, subtle as a change in the wind, but just as unmistakable. The shift became impossible to ignore during the blizzard that struck in January. For 3 days, they were trapped together in the cabin, while wind howled like a living thing and snow piled against the walls. Maverick slept on the floor near the fireplace, insisting that Violet take the cabin's single bed. But the storm's intensity made normal activities impossible. Instead, they talked. Really talked, sharing stories and dreams and fears they'd never voiced to another soul. Violet told him about the loneliness of her privileged childhood, about parents who saw her as a commodity to be traded for social advancement. Maverick spoke of the weight of being the last of his family line, of building the broken arrow, as much to honor his grandfather's memory as to secure his own future. "I used to think love was something that happened to other people," Violet admitted on the second night of the storm, "something in novels and poetry, but not real life. What do you think now?" She turned her head to look at him across the small room. He was lying on his back, hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling. Even in the dim light, she could see the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. "Now, I think maybe I was looking for it in the wrong places." On the third morning, the storm broke, leaving the world transformed beneath a blanket of pristine white. Maverick dug them out of the cabin, creating a path to the creek and the small barn where their animals had weathered the storm. But when he returned for the midday meal, he found Violet crying. What's wrong? He was beside her chair in an instant, his hands gentle on her shoulders. I dreamed I could walk, she whispered. I dreamed we were dancing together by the creek, and the music was playing, and everything was perfect. Then I woke up and remembered. Maverick knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his work-roughened ones. Violet, look at me. She raised, her tear-stained face to his. You want to dance? Before she could protest, he lifted her from the chair, cradling her against his chest. Her arms went around his neck instinctively, and he began to move in a slow, gentle rhythm, turning in small circles beside the fireplace. There's no music, she whispered. There's always music, he said, his voice rough with emotion. In your heart, in mine, in the way the wind sings through the trees, you taught me that. They swayed together in the silence that wasn't silent at all, and Violet felt something break open inside her chest, not the bitter crack of despair she'd carried for months, but the sweet fracture of a heart learning to hope again. When he finally set her gently back in her chair, his hands lingered on her face, thumbs brushing away the last of her tears. I love you, Violet, Rainsong, he said simply. Not in spite of everything that brought you to me, but because of it. You're the strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever known. Maverick, she breathed, seeing her own feelings reflected in his storm-gray eyes. I know it's crazy, he continued. I know we've only known each other a few months, and I know I don't have much to offer except a borrowed cabin and a heart that's already yours. But if you'll have me, she silenced him with a kiss, her hands threading through his hair as she poured every unspoken feeling into the touch of her lips against his. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she smiled through her tears. Yes, she whispered, yes to all of it. Spring arrived at Whispering Creek like a symphony, with meadowlarks providing the melody and the rush of snowmelt creek water keeping the rhythm. Violet had never experienced a frontier spring before, and the sheer exuberance of life returning to the prairie left her breathless with wonder. I want to marry you properly, Maverick announced one morning in April, as they sat on the cabins. New front porch and other of his winter projects. Not just because we're living together, but because I want the whole world to know you're mine and I'm yours. The nearest preacher is in Redemption, Violet pointed out practically, though. Her heart soared at his words. That's a 2-day ride, and the town isn't exactly friendly territory for us. Then we'll bring the preacher here. Maverick's eyes held the determined glint she'd learned meant he was planning something ambitious. Along with anyone else who wants to come? It's time this valley had a proper celebration. What Maverick had in mind turned out to be far grander than a simple wedding ceremony. Working with Jeremiah Crow and a handful of other scattered ranchers, began planning the first annual Whispering Creek Gathering, a 3-day festival that would bring together every settler within 100 miles for music, dancing, games, and community. You're trying to create civilization in the middle of nowhere, Violet teased as she watched him sketch plans for a temporary stage and dance floor. I'm trying to create a place where you can shine, he corrected, kissing the top of her head. You've got music in you that needs to be shared, Violet. This valley deserves to hear what I get to hear every night. The project consumed their spring. Maverick rode to neighboring spreads, extending invitations and coordinating logistics. Violet worked on arrangements of her compositions, adapting them for the mix of instruments they expected: fiddles, harmonicas, guitars, and anything else folks might bring. She also wrote letters using her educated penmanship to create formal invitations for the festivities. But it was Jeremiah who surprised them both with his contribution. My Martha would have loved this, the old rancher said one evening as they sat around his kitchen table planning the final details. Always said this valley needed more than just cattle and wind. Needed music and laughter and people coming together. He paused, then looked directly at Violet. She'd have been proud to see what you've become. What do you mean? You came here broken, child. Not just in body, but in spirit. I've seen it before, folks who get dealt a bad hand and let it define them. But you took that broken place and turned it into something beautiful. That music of yours, it comes from the hurt, but it doesn't stay there. It lifts people up. Jeremiah's words proved prophetic when the gathering finally took place in late May. Families came from as far as 3 days' ride away, bringing wagons, tents, children, and instruments. The temporary settlement that sprang up along Whispering Creek looked like something from a fairy tale canvas in every color stretched between cottonwood trees. Cook fires sending fragrant smoke into the clear sky, children and dogs racing between the campsites. On the first evening, as the sun painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Violet took her place on the wooden stage Maverick had built. Her chair had been decorated with wildflowers gathered by the settler children, and her violin gleamed in the lamplight. She began with a simple folk tune, something everyone would recognize. But as her bow moved across the strings, she began to weave variations into the melody embellishments that spoke of wind across grass, of sunrise over endless sky, of the particular loneliness and beauty of the frontier. One by one, other musicians joined in, following her lead as she transformed the familiar into something transcendent. When the last note faded into the prairie night, the silence stretched for a heartbeat before erupting into applause and cheers. Violet felt tears on her cheeks, but for once they were tears of pure joy. "Play another," someone called from the crowd. "Give us one of your own songs," shouted another voice. For the next 2 hours, Violet held the gathering spellbound. She played compositions that told the story of the valley, its harsh winters, in glorious summers, its moments of despair and triumph, its capacity to break hearts and mend them stronger than before. She played the story of her own journey from broken society lady to woman of the frontier, and she played her love for the hard, its beautiful land that had become home. But most of all, she played her love for Maverick Cade, the lonely cowboy who had seen worth in what others dismissed as worthless. When she finally set down her violin, the crowd rose as one in a standing ovation that seemed to lift the stars themselves from the sky. Maverick was there in an instant, lifting her from the stage and spinning her around as the audience cheered. "I told you," he whispered in her ear, his voice hoarse with emotion.
"Oh."
"I told you that you were something special." The wedding took place. The next morning, with Preacher Dalton from Redemption officiating and what seemed like half the territory in attendance, Violet wore a dress of pale yellow cotton that one of the settler women had brought as a gift, and her hair was crowned with a wreath of prairie roses. But it was the look in Maverick's eyes as he said his vows that took her breath away, a look that said she was not just his wife, but his partner, his equal, his heart walking around outside his body. "I promise to love you not despite your wheels, but wheels and all," he said, adapting the traditional words in a way that made her laugh even as tears streamed down her face. "To honor the music in your heart and the strength in your spirit, but to build our dreams together, one note at a time." When they were pronounced husband and wife, the cheer that went up could probably be heard in the next county. The years that followed their wedding brought both the sweetest joys and the harshest trials that frontier life could offer. Maverick and Violet Cade became the heart of a growing community along Whispering Creek, with settlers drawn as much by the promise of Violet's music as by the good grazing land and reliable water. Their cabin grew too, Maverick adding rooms and improvements each summer. The most important addition was the music room, a spacious area, with perfect acoustics where Violet could compose and teach, and where the community gathered for regular concerts and celebrations. By their 3rd anniversary, Violet had taught a dozen children to play various instruments. The Whispering Creek Orchestra, as they grandly called themselves, was known throughout the territory. She'd also begun writing down her compositions, creating the first collection of original music born from the American frontier. But their greatest joy came in the 4th year of their marriage. When Dr. Howell rode out from Redemption with news that changed everything, "There's a surgeon in Denver," he told them, studying the detailed notes he'd taken during his examination of Violet, a fellow named Dr. Richardson. "He's been having success with spinal injuries like yours, not all of them, mind you, but enough to give hope. Surgery's risky and recovery would be long, but there's a chance, a chance I could walk again." Violet's voice was barely a whisper. "A chance," the doctor confirmed. "But I want you to understand the odds are perhaps 1 in 4, and the surgery itself could leave you worse off than you are now." That night, Violet and Maverick sat by their bedroom window, watching the stars wheel overhead and discussing the possibility that had been offered to them. "I don't need you to walk," Maverick said, holding her hand in the darkness. "You know that, don't you? I fell in love with who you are, not what your legs could." "Do I know?" Violet squeezed his fingers. "But I want to try, Maverick. Not for you, not for anyone else, but for me. I want to know I fought for every possibility." The journey to Denver took 3 weeks, with Maverick driving a specially modified wagon and half the Whispering Creek community sending along supplies, prayers, and letters of support. Dr. Richardson proved to be a thin, tense man with gentle hands and complete honesty about the risks involved. "I've performed this surgery 17 times, he told them. 6 patients regained significant mobility. 3 regained limited sensation, but remained wheelchair-bound. 5 saw no improvement at all, and 3... He paused. 3 died from complications. And if we do nothing?" Violet asked. "You continue exactly as you are now, which, from what I can observe, is a rich and fulfilling life." The surgery took place on a crisp October morning, with Maverick wearing a path in the hospital waiting room's wooden floor. For 6 hours, he paced and prayed and remembered every moment of happiness Violet had brought into his life. When Dr. Richardson finally emerged, exhaustion written in every line of his face, his first words were, "She's alive." The recovery was brutal. For 2 weeks, Violet drifted in and out of consciousness, fighting infection and the body's natural rebellion against such extensive trauma. Maverick never left her side, reading to her from her favorite books, playing her own compositions on the small harmonica he'd learned to use during the long evenings of their courtship, and filling her unconscious ears with stories of home. When she finally woke, her first word was his name. "I'm here," he whispered, taking her hand. "I'm here, and you're going to be fine. Can you?" She paused, gathering strength. "Can you touch my foot?" With hands that trembled, Maverick reached down and gently pressed his palm against her right foot. "I can feel it," Violet breathed, tears streaming down her face. "Maverick, I can feel your hand." The return of sensation came slowly, over weeks and then months. First touch, then the ability to move her toes, and gradual strength returning to muscles that had been dormant for years. Dr. Richardson was amazed by her progress, admitting that she was responding better than any patient he'd previously treated. But it was the day she took her first steps supported by parallel bars in Dr. Richardson's office, with Maverick's encouraging voice filling her ears that marked the true beginning of her new life. "One more," Maverick urged as she trembled with effort. "Just one more step, sweetheart." "I don't know if I can," she gasped. "Yes, you can. You're the strongest person I know. You're the woman who turned a poker game into a love story, who made the frontier sing with music, who taught an entire community to dream bigger. You can take one more step." She did. And then another. And another, until she collapsed into his arms, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. The journey home to Whispering Creek took twice as long as the trip to Denver. Not because of any physical limitations, but because Violet insisted on stopping to walk, however briefly, in every town they passed through. By the time they crested the final hill and saw their valley spread out below them, she was able to walk unassisted for nearly a quarter mile at a stretch. The homecoming celebration lasted 3 days. The entire community turned out to witness Violet's first dance with her husband. Not the gentle swaying they'd shared in their cabin years before, but a real dance, with steps and turns, and the kind of joyful movement she'd dreamed of through all those months of paralysis. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when she stood on her own 2 feet at the front of their music room and played her violin for the assembled crowd. The piece she chose was new, a composition she'd been working on during her recovery, and it told the story of a journey from darkness to light, from despair to hope, from limitation to limitless possibility. When the last note faded away, old Jeremiah Crow stood up in the back of the room, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Martha was right," he called out in his gravelly voice. "This valley needed more than cattle and wind. It needed a miracle." And that's what we got when Maverick brought home his bride. The applause that followed seemed to lift the roof off their small building, carrying their joy up into the vast Montana sky, where it could mingle with the stars and the endless wind that sang across the prairie. They all called home. 10 years after that first poker game in Redemption Saloon, Violet stood on the front porch of what was now known throughout the territory as the Cade Music Ranch, watching her husband work with a young Mustang in the training corral. At 38, Maverick moved with the same easy confidence that had first caught her attention. Though silver now threaded through his dark hair and lines of laughter had etched themselves around his eyes, their ranch had grown far beyond Jeremiah's original spread. What had begun as a survival partnership had blossomed into the most prosperous and innovative operation in 3 counties. Maverick's reputation as a horse trainer drew buyers from as far away as California, while Violet's music school had become the cultural heart of the entire region. But their greatest pride wasn't measured in acres, or cattle, or even the students, who traveled hundreds of miles to study at the Whispering Creek Conservatory, as the newspapers had taken to calling it. Their greatest pride was the community they'd helped build, a place where music and laughter rang out across the prairie, where children grew up believing they could achieve anything, and where love was measured not by conventional standards, but by the depth of commitment to people were willing to make to each other's dreams. Mrs. Cade. The voice belonged to 16-year-old Melody Songbird, a Lakota girl whose natural musical talent had brought her to their ranch 3 years earlier. The evening students are arriving. Violet smiled, still marveling at how easily she could now walk from porch to music room, though she kept her original wheeled chair as a reminder of the journey that had brought her here. Tonight's class included a dozen adults, ranch hands, and shopkeepers, mothers and grandfathers who came twice a week to learn that music wasn't the exclusive province of the educated and wealthy. The evening began with warm-up exercises, then moved through individual lessons tailored to each student's skill level and interests. Violet had discovered that her own unconventional path to music made her particularly gifted at teaching others who didn't fit traditional molds. She could reach the shy ones and challenge the overconfident ones, always remembering what it felt like to discover that your voice mattered. But it was after the formal lesson ended that the real magic happened. As had become tradition, the students and teachers gathered in a circle, sharing music that came from their hearts rather than any prescribed curriculum. Tonight, old Pete Morrison played a tune he'd learned from his grandfather while young. Danny Fletcher sang a song he'd written about his new colt. Then Melody Songbird stood up, her violin cradled in her arms. "I wrote something for Mr. and Mrs. Cade," she said, her voice carrying the soft formality of someone speaking a second language with great care. "Ah, for showing me that music is not about where you come from, but where your heart wants to go." Piece she played was haunting and beautiful, weaving together elements of traditional Lakota music with the frontier melodies Violet had taught her. It spoke of 2 worlds learning to understand each other, of bridges built from notes instead of words, of the universal language that connected all hearts. When the last note faded away, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. "Thank you, Melody," Violet said, her voice thick with emotion. "That was extraordinary." After the students departed, Violet and Maverick walked hand in hand to their favorite spot by the creek. The same cottonwood trees that had sheltered their first camping spot still grew there, now mature giants that housed families of songbirds and provided shade for summer picnics. "Do you ever think about that night in the saloon?" Violet asked, settling onto the bench Maverick had built beside the water. "Every day." He sat beside her, his arm naturally finding its place around her shoulders. "Best poker hand I ever lost." "You didn't lose," she corrected with a smile. "You won everything that mattered." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the creek's eternal song and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. Above them, stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that had watched over their first tentative conversations, their wedding dance, and every day of the life they'd built together. "Violet, I got a letter from the territorial governor today. He wants to commission you to write a piece for statehood celebration. Says your music represents the true spirit of Montana, better than anything he's ever heard. Violet leaned back to look at his face in the starlight. What did you tell him? I told him he'd have to ask you himself, but that if you agreed, Montana would be getting the most beautiful anthem ever written. Violet laughed, the sound carrying across the water like music itself. You're biased. Damn right I am. Maverick pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I'm biased toward the woman who took a broken-down cowboy's life and filled it with more joy than he ever dreamed possible, as if summoned by their conversation. The sound of music drifted from the main house, one of their current students, practicing scales on the piano they'd shipped in from St. Louis. The notes were hesitant, imperfect, but filled with the determination of someone reaching for something better. That's Widow Patterson, Violet observed. She never had the chance to learn as a child. Says she wants to play hymns for her grandchildren. And she will, Maverick said, with the quiet confidence of a man who'd learned that impossible dreams had a way of becoming reality when the right people believed in them. A shooting star streaked across the Montana sky, bright and brief and beautiful. Violet made a wish not for herself, for she had everything her heart desired, but for all. The lonely souls still searching for their place in the world, may they find their own version of what she and Maverick had discovered, that love wasn't about perfection or conventional happy endings, but about two people choosing to build something beautiful together, one day at a time. Years later, when historians wrote about the settling of the American West, they would record the facts and figures, the cattle drives and gold rushes, the railroad building and territorial wars, but they would miss the smaller, more important story of how civilization truly came to the frontier, not through conquest or commerce, but through the simple act of people choosing to see the worth in each other and to build communities based on that recognition. The music that still echoes across the Montana plains tells a different story than the history books. It tells of a poker game that became a love story, of a woman who refused to let circumstances define her limitations, and of a man who understood that the greatest treasures aren't found in the ground, but in the courage to open your heart to possibilities you never imagined. In Whispering Creek, they still hold the annual gathering that Maverick and Violet started all those years ago. The stage is permanent now, built of local stone and Montana timber, and musicians come from around the world to perform where the pride of the plains first shared her music with an audience larger than one devoted husband. But the most popular part of each year's festival isn't the grand performances or famous guests. It's the community circle on the final evening, where anyone can stand up and share a song, a story, or simply a moment of gratitude for the reminder that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as the worst, and that love, real love, isn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone worth fighting for. The bronze plaque beside the stage reads simply, "In memory of Violet and Maverick Cade, who taught us that every ending can be a beginning and every limitation can become a doorway to grace." Their story became legend, passed down through generations of settlers who learned that the true spirit of the American frontier wasn't about conquering the wilderness, but about refusing to let the wilderness conquer the human capacity for love, hope, and the kind of music that can transform a broken world into something beautiful. And on quiet nights, when the wind blows just right across the prairie grass, old-timers swear you can still hear the sound of a violin playing melodies that speak of second chances, of dreams that refuse to die, and of the kind of love that proves some gambles are worth taking everything when you're betting everything you have on a hand that looks like certain defeat. The lonely cowboy and the woman he was given as a joke had indeed made her the pride of the plains. But more than that, they had made themselves living proof that in a world too often divided by what makes people different, the things that make us human, hope, music, love, and the courage to reach for something better, are exactly the same. No matter where we come from or what circumstances have written across our lives, their legacy wasn't measured in acres or gold, but in the countless lives they touched, the music that outlived them both, and the enduring truth that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the worst possible circumstances and the most unlikely of partners. In the end, that's what made Violet Rainsong Cade truly the pride of the plains, not despite her limitations, but because of how she transformed them into strengths and how she used those strengths to lift up everyone around her until the whole territory rang with the sound of people discovering what they were capable of when someone believed in their worth. The music plays on, carried by the wind across the endless sky, a testament to the power of love to transform not just a hearts, but an entire world.